For centuries, traditional theology has approached the Qur'an with a specific baseline assumption that the text is an open historical document requiring vast external supplementation to be understood. This necessary supplement is universally identified as the traditional Hadith corpus, a massive secondary database of human transmissions, sayings, and historical reports spanning generations. Visualize that assumption with these bookshelves. This staggering volume of literature represents the mass of external data assumed necessary to decode the core text. The Dual Caustic Universe, or DCU, framework outright rejects this premise. The DCU treats the text not as a linear historical chronicle, but as a closed, self-referential physics engine. In information theory, a closed topological manifold generates its data entirely from within. Every node corresponds to another node inside the system. External inputs are systematically rejected. This raises a strict architectural question. If the system operates as a closed vacuum, how does the system itself define and process the concept of a hadith? Treating this closed engine as an open system is not a harmless choice. It's a fatal software error that corrupts the entire output matrix. To understand how the system secures its boundaries, we have to look at its cryptographic lock, the triadic seal. The Qur'an utilizes 3 distinct firewalls to explicitly block external data. Verse 39:23 operates as the content lock, defining the book as mathani, oft repeated and self-referencing. The system generates its own meaning by cross-referencing internal roots. Nothing enters the system from outside the system. The book acts as its own decoder. Verse 45:6 acts as the authority lock, asking, "Then in what hadith after Allah and his verses will they believe?" This zero-tolerance boundary isolates the language of the text from legacy traditions, rejecting external doctrinal inputs completely. Finally, verse 6116 engages the method lock. This verse warns that following the majority on earth will lead directly into zan, conjecture. It mathematically defines external human consensus as an entropic drift away from absolute truth. With these 3 locks engaged, any external doctrine attempting to enter the matrix is flagged as a structural breach. We must reevaluate the very definition of hadith, using only parameters found inside the sealed field. We can test this by running a strict database query. If we input the exact term hadith into this sealed system, we can observe the outputs without external interference. The system immediately sorts every occurrence of the term into 3 rigid lexical clusters. There are no anomalies. Every usage falls into 3 registers. Register 1 designates the I9 field. This is the infinite, self-referential container of divine memory and revelation. In this primary register, the Qur'an applies the term hadith directly to itself, establishing its position as the apex standard. Look at this physical artifact. Within the system's logic, this self-contained document is the sole authority. In verse 39:23, the text explicitly labels its own architecture as Ahsan Al Hadith, the best hadith. Verse 12:111 reinforces this by stating the Qur'an is not a fabricated or invented narrative, but the living confirmation of all truth. Within the system's highest register, the term hadith is entirely monopolized by the Qur'an itself. There is absolutely no structural room for a secondary external tier of doctrine. The second data cluster reveals exactly how the system handles external or human-invented hadith. The system does not categorize external reports as a supplement, it flags them as a deliberate structural defilement. This decaying code maps directly to terminal entropy. It is the munafiq trap. Verse 31:6 specifically identifies the purchasing of idle hadith as an intentional mechanism designed to mislead observers from the established path. Verses 4:140 and 668 establish the penalty for engaging with this entropy. Participating in these unverified transmissions causes the total defilement of the observer's faith state. Sitting in circles of external narration literally rewrites the observer's internal code to match that of a hypocrite. This photograph shows men sitting in academic circles, transmitting information. When this transmission involves unverified doctrine, the system isolates it. Verses 66:3 and 33:53 demonstrate how private social hadith, everyday human conversations, are explicitly walled off and separated from divine revelation. Information leakage between human conversation and divine law causes systemic division and fractures the topology. Register 2 defines external hadith as a fatal systemic virus. It is not a helpful theological tool. It is an agent of degradation. That brings us to the final cluster. These are occurrences of the term hadith that do not fit the apex self-designation, nor the entropic trap. This cluster consists strictly of historical bridges. These bridges operate horizontally. They transfer context between events, but they do not rewrite the core foundational code. When verses 29 and 51-24 ask, "Has the hadith of Moses or Abraham reached to?" the term is functioning purely as an internal historical pointer to a prior event. Verse 12:6 frames the interpretation of narratives as a localized analytical skill used to understand events, not as a universal lawmaking function. Outside of these three registers, the apex, the entropy, and the pointer, no fourth register exists in the entire corpus. The traditional concept of an external, legally binding corpus of sayings is entirely missing from the system's native code. The system uses the term as its own title, as a warning label for entropy, and as a historical bridge. It systematically excludes any space for external doctrine. We must now pivot from analyzing the static matrix to analyzing the active user traversing it. We call this node the reader. The reader arrives at a binary choice: accept register 1 and integrate into the eternal topology of the closed book, or accept register 2 and embrace the entropy of external data. The system generates a specific topological profile for the user who chooses the latter, the mushrik munafiq who knows. This actor does not misunderstand the system. They intentionally choose to corrupt it. This corruption happens mechanically. The user deliberately bypasses the required reasoning protocol outlined in verse 10:100, choosing instead to import external conjecture, as warned in verse 23:44. Importing external hadith is never an innocent academic mistake. It is a deliberate breach of the closed field security architecture. Verses 77:50 and 7:185 deliver the final topological verdict. The system enacts an absolute structural rejection of any doctrine existing outside the triadic seal. In the DCU framework, external hadith is a systemic bug that causes the user's interface to crash. The book is the hadith is the book, and the manifold is permanently sealed.